Okay, so hi, Carwyn.
Hello, good to be with you, Gwyneth.
Yeah, great to be with you today. So would you start by just introducing yourself a little bit and yeah, just telling us about what it is that you do?
Yeah, well, so my name is Carwyn. I'm originally from Cardiff. That means that I'm a city boy originally, but I now live in Carmarthenshire, which is a very rural part of Wales. And I've written a couple of books. So this one, Apples of Wales, was the first book really on the whole topic of orchards and apples and all that kind of thing in Wales. People said that it never happened, that it wasn't possible, and that's just not true. So that was that, and then this has just come out, Welsh Food Stories, and that is really telling it is actually a book of food history, but I decided not to use history in the title. But it's telling the story of, if you like, you've got to use the word carefully, but if you like, traditional foods in Wales, those that have survived into the present and how they've survived and why, and those that are now kind of experiencing a revival and a renaissance, and the people behind the foods as well.
Great. And I always start by asking how it was that you got into this. So what was it that first inspired you to write that first book?
Yeah, well, the apple book came about because I was back in the day, gardening wasn't cool, at least in the UK. So go back about 15 years ago, and I was probably the only teenager in the city at the time, at least in my city, who was interested in gardening. At least it felt that way. And the honest answer is that I was learning about growing veg and fruit from my grandfather, and then I realized or found out that it's easier, less effort to do fruit than to do veg, started looking into, okay, right, I want to grow fruit, I want to grow apples, and then there's a lot of options when you want to grow apples. And then this variety from this part of England, or this variety from France, or this variety. And so, what about where the apples that are from round here? And the answer comes back, there's nothing from around here. And you look in books and you see these statements along the lines of Wales has never produced fruit because the soil and climate are not suitable. And I knew that was wrong because I was also a nerd in terms of just literature and poetry and old literature and medieval poetry. So I knew that there was something not right there. And that really began a kind of odyssey for me of just trying to uncover some of this heritage of fruit growing, like across this country, where I remember speaking to the foremost historian of Wales. He's died now, a guy called John Davis, and asking him about apples and orchards in Wales historically. He said, no, I don't think in my research I've ever come across that. But actually, from folklore to place names to nursery rhymes, there's just a massive wealth, and the maps. We know historically that apples were very widely grown and were an important part of a kind of local food economy, including cider, and recipes that use them in baking. So there's just so much there.
Well, yeah, the first thing that I thought of was Avalon, right? The island of apples. And for people who don't know, Aval is the Welsh word for apple. So
yeah, exactly. And they're there in the medieval laws as well. It's noting in detail the value of an apple tree when it's in fruit and not in fruit, whether it's a sour wild apple or a cultivated sweet apple. It's all there. And it's just fascinating for me to reflect on all these things that are kind of under the surface, not just in Wales, but beyond as well, in terms of, if you like, the people's past, because this is not the past. It is and it isn't, or you always need nuance. I was about to say this is not the past of the great princes and, politics. Actually, it does touch on that as well. But there's also something here in terms of, not your common people's knowledge of how to cultivate, what to cultivate, and how a kind of local circular economy works, which obviously was the case pre-20th century.
So what was the most interesting thing you found out during your research?
Gosh, I think something that's fresh in my mind is in the recent book, Welsh Food Stories. So there's a there's a really rich heritage of shellfish in Wales, cockles in particular. So the cockle fisheries in southwest Wales are still, the harvest is still done by hand using a rake and baskets, as has been done probably since Roman times. And that is, and that is still how it's done today. And a couple of fascinating things there. Number one is that fishery in particular, which exports hundreds of tons a year of cockles, that is deemed the most sustainable fishery, cockle fishery, anywhere in the British Isles, because it's not mechanized. And the reason it's not mechanized is because the licenses belong to local families, as they have done, going way back. Whereas in other parts, some people, if you're listening in the UK, you might remember disasters, real tragedies happening in places like Morecambe Bay, with migrant labour being used to pick these cockles in terrible conditions. And that is because the licenses for the cockles were sold to these big multinational companies. So local ownership here has a direct effect on human well-being, on the sustainability of the fishery itself. But then it goes even deeper, because if you go back 150 years, even less, 100 years, so pre-First World War, the oyster fishery in southwest Wales was just as big as the cockle fishery. And I hasten to add, these are oysters that were a good source of protein for the poor, rather than primarily being a kind of luxury export item. So you had oyster fishery and cockle fishery, both as important as each other. The working classes were the people who ate these shellfish. And I grew up, it's not like this is all dead. I grew up eating cockles as a kind of normal thing. I grew up in a small terrace house in the city, not some kind of big mansion. But the oyster fishery was overexploited, and so it collapsed. And there are people trying to bring it back now, but basically the story is of ecological degradation leading to the loss of livelihood and just a complete collapse, both ecologically and economically. Whereas the cockles, because they were harvested in this different way using lower impact methods, not only have not collapsed, but remain, the beds remain in good health and provide, hundreds and hundreds of tons of very sustainable, good quality food for people.
And I saw as well you were writing about the lava bread, right? The seaweed being a big important part. Is it still popular down in South Wales? Because I think it never was such a big thing of where I come from.
Yeah, it is. And in the multinational, supermarket Tesco's down the road here, you can buy lava bread. You can get it widely anywhere really, in kind of local shops, as well as more foodie places. So it is. However, and this is, I think, part of the point of this book for me is, Wales is a Western society, an economy. There's really interesting stuff in terms of the culture, and an argument that can be made in terms of indigeneity, in terms of Welsh language culture. It's problematic, but there's something in that. But it is nevertheless a Western economy, and it was the first society to be industrialized, so more people working in industry than on the land. So you've got all of that, and industrial decline as well. And in one sense, you could say, sometimes we talk about Wales being pioneers in decline. We're ahead of the curve in terms of decline. And that's a difficult place to be, obviously, for a lot of people. It also creates a bit of space for experimentation and for rediscovering things. So lava bread is a really interesting and important example of this. So lava, in case people don't know, and I should have said at the beginning, it is seaweed, and it is one of many edible seaweed species around the coasts of the British Isles. But it just happens to be, this is my one chauvinistic statement, it just happens to be the most nutritious of all the edible seaweeds that are available in the North Atlantic. And it also happens to be the one that the Welsh very wisely picked out and favoured above all the others. Others were used, And in Ireland and Scotland, they focused more on dulse, which was also used here, but it's not quite as good as lava. So lava is just, it is actually the best plant-based source of iodine, vitamin B12. I mean, if you're a vegan and you know anything about the need, you know, the word superfood is overused. Lava is one of the few things where you're not overusing the term. People can just look it up. And so it's still widely available, but it tends to be only the older generations who are eating it and buying it regularly. So we're in this place where the Americanization of food, or the delocalization, the globalization of food, has meant that people view these local food products on the whole, under a certain age, as being old-fashioned, whereas actually they hold a lot of the answers. So that was part of what I was trying to do with this book, was actually just to fly the flag and say, hey, we've actually still got a lot of these traditions, and we, you know, they are where a lot of the answers for the 21st century in terms of climate change and sustainable economies and just human health, you know, all of this stuff. Who suffers when we harvest lava and eat it locally here in Wales? The answer is nobody. Whereas, you know, we talk about a burger or soya, you know, either side of that kind of vegetarian debate, burger or soya, a lot of people suffer, and the planet suffers. So just flying the flag and saying, come on, we've got to use these local resources. Our ancestors weren't idiots. Let's actually give them some credit. Let's accord them some agency in terms of their decision making.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, when you said that these might provide a lot of the answers, you know, what are the questions? And obviously I found your article, I think it was in the Post-Carbon Institute, right, that you'd written an article linking this, not just to say, hey, you know, look at our traditional foods, but to link it to, yeah, all of the challenges of the 21st century. So yeah, what's the deeper mission, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, on every level, I mean, there's so many ways you can look at this, but on every level, keeping that variety of local food alive, but actually a lot more than that, developing it, re-expanding it, rebuilding a local food economy in a place like Wales. And I think what is true here is true in different ways for a whole load of other places across the Western world. It really is a win-win-win. And the only people who lose out are shareholders and global corporations. So let me give an example rooted in a Welsh context. It's a very hilly country, as you know very well, and particularly the inland areas, there is more than enough rain that falls in a year. Put those two things together, and one of the main solutions that people found historically, and you can go back, you know, well over 1,000 years with this, is water mills. So people ate bread, grain's really important. So you harness the energy in the water coming from gravity, and you use that to mill your grain. Okay, so far so good. Now that whole network of local water mills fell out of use in rural Wales, generally in the 1950s and 60s. So later than in some places in the West. But yeah, that's generally what happened. A lot of the buildings are still there. A lot of the mill ponds are still there. And some of them have been, you know, wasn't all that much work needed doing to be restored and are in working use again, milling grain. Now, if you go back to the pandemic, which is, you know, there's a whole load of lessons that we need to take from that period of lockdown, rather than just go back to, you know, a bad old normal, if you like. In the UK, at least, flour was in really short supply. People needed bread and people needed flour, and you just couldn't get it for love or money. And what they did, so one of the places I write about in the book, a mill called Felinganol, but this is true in other places as well, that's been running again for about 10 years now, you know, they had all this grain that hadn't been milled, and they normally mill however many tons a week. I forget the exact stats, but they just kept the mill going day in, day out. So they just kept the water flowing through. Plenty of water in the system, you know, it runs through anyway down to the coast. They just kept it going through. And so their output per week doubled or tripled. And so they were just able to produce so much more flour to sell to local people. And here's the point about this, is that didn't use any more electricity. It didn't emit any more carbon. You know, there was no, there as a business, you know, their kind of gas costs or whatever didn't go up because the technology is a wooden water mill that runs off water. You know, so they were, the output, they were able to produce a lot more flour, and the environmental impact of that was precisely zero. You know, it's this simple stuff that can so easily be dismissed as, I don't know, but in Welsh we have this nursery rhyme, tu ôl i'r dorth mae'r blawd, tu ôl i'r blawd mae'r felyn. You know, and children sing it, so it says behind the loaf is the flour, behind the flour is the mill, and it kind of goes back and says where it all comes from. And that kids sing it, but the rest of society, we view that as just antiquated, old-fashioned, you know, folklore. But actually, dig a little deeper. What is this? There really isn't anything apart from skills and ambition to stop there being a local water mill of that sort in every part of Wales, and probably, you know, many other parts of the Western world as well.
Yeah, and it seems like what stands in our way of doing that is maybe just the interests of a few corporations. I don't know. And obviously the long-standing, you know, colonization of the mind, where people think, oh, our ways are old-fashioned and antiquated, and we want to be modern, which apparently means being completely disconnected, right, from your food supply or from where anything comes from.
I mean, there are practical obstacles around, I mean, price. It would take a lot of work to get the price. You know, food justice is really important. Cheap food matters. So there's practical obstacle there. There's a practical obstacle around skills. There's a practical obstacle around the whole supply chain, from the locally grown wheat or, you know, grains, actually not just wheat, that's part of the point, all the way through to the finished loaf of bread. But they are practical challenges rather than insurmountable obstacles. And ultimately it's willpower. And, you know, to an extent, political willpower. I mean, this kind of thing has to be both bottom up and top down. And yeah, there's stuff, again, that I go after in Welsh Food Stories in the book, just trying to tease apart a little bit. It's not, you know, an economic book. It's not an academic work either, but I do tease apart a little bit some of the influences that government policy has and the economic pressures that shape the food system to be what it is, rather than what it was and what it could be. And what it could be is not the same as what it was. I mean, that's an important point here. It's not, I'm not making an argument in terms of going back to the past, but I am saying that our current food system is completely dependent on fossil fuels and cheap fossil fuels. And food systems up until, to an extent, the Second World War, to an extent later, but, you know, early 20th century, food systems in the West were generally not, I mean, increasingly, but generally not dependent on fossil fuels. Is there stuff that we can learn from that? We would be the most arrogant, hubristic people ever to have lived. I mean, that might be the accusation leveled against us by our descendants anyway. But, you know, let's try and be humble. Let's try and learn from you know, these pre-modern systems and foodways, because there's a logic in them that works, that fed people, and that doesn't depend on fossil fuels.
Yeah, brilliant. And if we don't, what kind of future are we looking at anyway?
Yeah, exactly. So I dedicated the book to my children. So my son Arthur, who you might hear screaming in the background, he's just turned 2. So he was born in 2020. So if he lives to be 80, that will be 2100. And to my grandparents, all of whom have died now. But that was very deliberate, that back and forth, because this is about people, as you know, as is food, always. Anyway, but I could go off on one there.
Oh, well, thank you. And I think it's very important for us to think of future generations and of our ancestors, right? To stay connected, as you said, not to be arrogant. I think we've invented everything afresh as well.
Yeah, I think there's something profoundly countercultural in terms of modern Western culture in trying to cultivate that intergenerational view of things, which both looks backwards and forwards. I think that goes against the grain, but probably in the way that we need things to go against the grain of the logic of the current system.
Yeah, I like that you use the phrase "go against the grain" as we're talking about the mill. Yes. But also that Wales is the first nation in the world, right, to have a Future Generations Commissioner. So I think it's very poignant that this is sort of coming from Wales at the moment. Something to be proud of, maybe.
Hopefully, and the proof will be in the pudding. You know, another thing that, again, forgive the food-related pun, but another thing that I've put a chapter in the book about leeks. So leeks is the national vegetable of Wales. There's a whole lot of symbolism there. But actually, and people will wear leeks on St. David's Day, but actually, you know, look into it, and there's history around leek, and it's not just chance that the leek has this kind of symbolic value. But what can we do to move from something like the leek being a symbolic thing primarily to actually being, and again, leek here stands for horticulture and vegetables in general, but also in particular because it can stand the winter here. And again, you know, there's value in that because if it stands the winter outside, it doesn't need to be stored in, you know, and storage always means energy use and all this stuff. So again, start digging under the surface, and something that we've retained as a symbol. Actually, there's an agricultural and a sustainable kind of sustainability logic to why it was picked in the first place, which we could, and people are now tapping into as a pathway for the future. And part of this as well is that currently in the global food system, hardly anybody grows leeks in Wales. But the people who are now doing it are doing it using organic methods. They're using a whole systems approach. So the, you know, if you like, the renaissance of the Welsh leek is actually the story of localizing food. And there's something quite beautiful in this cycle where we've gone from it being a ubiquitous food, which is why it became a symbol, and it now going again from being a symbol to the seeds of a newly relocalized food culture, which is happening. You know, it's, again, policy matters here. Welsh government is finally starting to really invest in horticulture and grants for horticulture, which necessarily, this is not horticulture to supply global supermarket food chains, it's horticulture to supply local people with local veg. So it is happening now, and the leek is a great symbol of that.
Thank you so much, Carwyn. So we'll conclude the English part of the interview here, but you can also join us for a Welsh version.